Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to look at economic growth. So let's dive right into this lecture here. All right, so we're going to look at we're going to describe the significance of real GDP per capita. We're going to determine the key factors that contribute towards long-run economic growth. We're going to show how economic growth is represented on the production possibilities frontier. We're going to examine the impact of investment and capital goods. And we're going to differentiate between the long-run and short-run economic growth. So we're going to see what are the causes, what are the root causes of economic growth. And basically, we're going to put a lot of emphasis in this particular lecture on how to put it together and put it on graphs that you're actually going to see on the AP macro exam. Because I could go and talk a lot about different issues of poverty and growth. But again, the objective for this lecture, as with all the lectures, is try to get the information in a way that will help you get the answers correct on the AP macro exam. So I'm trying to condense it and tailor it for your particular purposes here. So let's go ahead and go right into the material here. So real GDP per capita. It's a key statistic that is used to measure economic growth and standard of living. So this key statistic is called the real GDP per capita. And how do you find the real GDP per capita? It's real GDP divided by the population. For example, the real GDP per capita is going to be much higher in Taiwan than in China, the mainland China, simply because the GDP in China is going to be much higher. But you divide that by the over 1 trillion population, and you're not going to get more than maybe like 8,000, 9,000, maybe 10,000. But in Taiwan, the standard of living is quite comparable to that of the United States, maybe a little bit less, $35,000, $40,000. But again, you have the idea of looking at that statistic to see where economic growth has occurred. But at the same time, it's not a policy goal itself. But again, a byproduct. It's a useful summary that measures a nation's economic progress. So you can't, you could, but it wouldn't be really helpful for the U.S. government, for example, to target, let's try to grow our GDP per capita. Well, there's no way that it would really make sense to try to do that. But when you are trying to improve the economy, when trying to, invest in human capital and technology and increase productivity, this is a byproduct that's naturally going to happen. So it's not necessarily a goal, but this is kind of a measuring stick as to whether or not a country is doing well. So if you're living in the United States and you want to live in a country with a relatively similar standard of living, then it's probably helpful to check. It's helpful to check which country has the highest GDP per capita. And the U.S. actually is not the highest. One of the top, again, depends on a year-to-year basis. One of the top places you want to live is actually Luxembourg, which is located in Europe, if you want to look at GDP per capita. Very tiny population, but again, it shows you that GDP per capita, it equalizes per person, so that's a better measure of standard of living. Okay. In 2008, the median household income in the United States was roughly $50,000. And again, it's not exactly the same thing, but if you take GDP as income and GDP as expenses, one person's expense is also a person's income. So $50,000, the household income, you can look at that as kind of being very similar to GDP per capita. In 2008. In 1908, it was about 15% of that, or roughly $8,000 using today's dollars. So something happened in that 100-year time span, in 1908 to 2008, that caused long-run economic growth. In many countries today, the standard of living is less than it was in the United States over 100 years ago. And China basically reached the point around 2008 where the standard of living in China in 2008 is basically, or was basically, comparable to that of the United States in 1908. And again, to give you a further dose of reality, and the state of global economic standard of living, India has yet to reach, as of 2008, India did not reach America's standard of living in 1908. And again, it's not something naturally that will happen. You can go through long periods of time where you see no real improvement in standard of living. Look at the Dark Ages. Dark Ages, it's appropriately named because during that period of time, the standard of living was roughly the same. You didn't see a huge improvement in the stuff that was produced in the economy. Long-run economic growth. Again, that's what we're going to look at and focus on more. It's this gradual progress of the real GDP per capita in the U.S. that increased by 1.9% every year, and it happened in a very systematic fashion that led to where the economy is for the United States today. Now, the growth rate that we achieved in the middle of the 20th century, today we're not growing at that same rate. We are growing as an economy. The rate at which we're growing has kind of slowed down. Is that a cause for concern? Probably. Are the days numbered where the United States is the dominant country? Possibly, but China, it's a growing economic force. But again, as far as the GDP per capita, definitely the United States is. If you want to use economic measurements, it's a better place to live, right? And it's going to be like that for quite some time. But is there an endpoint? There probably might be a case to be made. But for now, just know that whereas the U.S. is experiencing closer to 2 to 3% GDP growth per year, a country like China has been experiencing 7 to 8% growth year in, year out. And again, they might be slowing down as well. A lot of things, depending on what these countries do to invest in long-run growth, it's kind of going to determine the economic future of these countries. Now, what are sources of growth? Okay, and again, these are basically another way of saying that what makes a country wealthy, and really, it's not the money. So. Again, I've gone to great lengths to show you in these past lectures that money in the long run doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of economic growth. It's a means of production. It's very essential to an economy to facilitate trade. It's a medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. But in of itself, money is not really the goal. And it's really the factors of production. And it's this land, labor, and capital. And by improving on a lot of means of productivity, that's the way that long-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. That's the way that we experience long-run aggregate or long-run economic growth. It's not really using monetary or fiscal policy. It's investing in human capital and technology and all that stuff. So physical capital. So building and machines today, they make the average worker much more productive. When individuals are given better tools, more tools, availability of access to physical capital, it makes economic growth a lot more feasible. More important than physical capital would be human capital. So improvement in labor created by education and knowledge in the workforce. In the early 20th century, less than a quarter of American workers had a college degree. Today, the percentage, obviously not 100%, but closer to 3/4 of the workforce, you can argue, it went to some college. So it's becoming a much more educated workforce, and with a much more educated workforce, you can expect more complex tasks to be accomplished. And so again, this human capital, the human capital element to the economy has increased the long-run aggregate supply. And technology, technical means for the production of goods and services. The way things are being distributed, the way things are being learned. I mean, what you're watching right now, it's evidence of an increase in technology. I mean, who would have thought? This being filmed and being able to be projected, streaming via the internet. It's increasing the goods and services that can be produced, and the time that it takes to produce these things it's freeing up individuals to be able to do other stuff. So it's this idea of opportunity cost, to kind of bring back the elements of the fundamentals of economics. So what causes long-run economic growth? Again, it's a combination of these factors. And if the government facilitates this long-run economic growth, you're going to see a higher growth rate. And in countries that really inhibit this economic growth, then you're not going to see economies thrive as much as in countries where innovation is rewarded, where there's more access to college education, things of that nature. So let's take a look at economic growth on a production possibilities graph here. So again, this is something that in the beginning of the unit we went over, production possibilities graph, and we're gonna use this to kind of show how economic growth is shown on a production possibilities graph. We're gonna look at how it's shown on aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. But let's start off with the PPF graph here. So economic growth results in an outward shift of the production possibilities curve. So let's examine an economy with steak and chicken. Okay, so very, very simple economy and a production possibilities graph here. Let's use a concave production possibilities graph. So you have increasing opportunity costs. Okay, so let's put chicken here on the y-axis. Again, on a production possibilities graph, it can be any two items, and it's used to highlight the trade-offs that countries face when they make production decisions. And let's go ahead and put steak here, steak on the x-axis. Okay, and a production possibilities frontier. Let's put different numbers here. So let's say you can make 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 steak here. And here, let's go by 20s here. 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100. Okay, so let's put the original production possibility frontiers as such here. So any point here on this graph would be points of efficiency. So let's label this point A. Let's label this point B. Label this as point C, and label this as point D. So what are these points of efficiency here? It's always good to do a little bit of review. Points of efficiency. Okay. So that would be point A, which is going to be 0 steak and 80 chicken. Okay, point B. Okay, this one's going to be a little bit. Okay, let's do 30 steak and 60 chicken. And then point C is going to be 35 steak and 40 chicken. And then finally, point D, you have 40 steak and 0 chicken. So you see increasing opportunity cost right here. So this is what a production possibility graph exemplifies. So for the first 30 steak is going to cost you 20 chicken, and the next 5 steak will cost you 20 chicken as well. So it's a higher rate because you're only getting 5 steak and you're still paying 20 chickens here. And now you only get 5 more steak and you're giving a 40 chicken here. So you see increasing opportunity cost. It works the other way as well. When you add 40 chicken, you're giving up only 5 steak. You add 20 chicken, and you give up 5 steak, that same constant amount. And you add 20 chicken, and now you give up 30 steak. So you have increasing opportunity cost here. Now, how would economic growth be defined? Again, let's say you invest in technology that makes chicken to reproduce at a more efficient rate, or the way that cows are produced and slaughtered for its steak. Let's say there's a more efficient technology that creates this steak here. Then what happens is that there's an outward shift in the production possibilities frontier, and it's exemplified by this here. So now, you have points that are on the production possibilities frontier. You can make both more steak and more chicken here. Let's call this a dash right here. C and D. So an outward shift of the production possibilities frontier means that you are capable of making more chicken and steak. So investment versus consumer goods. So how would that look on a production possibilities frontier? So let's take a look here on the y-axis. Let's say it represents investment goods. And on the x-axis, you're going to have consumer goods. Now again, on the production possibilities frontier, it can be any two categories of goods, but a common tactic that the AP exam will use will be between consumer investment goods, and this will come in the context of a multiple choice question or even a free response. But you're going to draw a concave shape production possibilities frontier. It's generally going to look at this here. Now, there are a couple possibilities here, and let's go ahead and draw the points as I've listed, and I'll kind of explain what's meant by this here. This would be point A. So if it were the case that investment goods, if it were the case that investment goods were the only thing produced in the economy, that would be point A. Point D represents only consumer goods. So let's say people don't invest at all, they just purchase consumer goods. And B and C would be somewhere in between. Now, this is basically what I would want you to draw here and be able to draw here. But kind of maybe more of a thought-provoking question would be, what country would experience more economic growth in the future? A country that produces a point A and point D. And hopefully you would understand that the country with point A would actually experience more economic growth in the long run, because if investment goods are being produced, then that's going to necessarily expand the production possibilities frontier. Whereas if consumer goods are produced, then it's not going to increase economic growth as much. So maybe a more nuanced question, and again, something the AP exam wouldn't ask, just because there's some maybe some subjectivity in there, would be if you had China and then the United States, which one would be representing point B and which one would be representing point C? If you're looking at the year, let's say 2014 here, which one would be point B and which one would be point C? Now, you'd have to look at, okay, which country spends more on consumer versus which country spends more on investment goods. And if you look at that, the United States imports a whole lot of product from China, and it's really consumer-driven economy. Again, roughly 70% of U.S. GDP is consumer expenditures. So if you want to put a crude generalization, then C would probably represent more of the United States, whereas China, more of its products are spent towards investment goods. Again, this is kind of a crude generalization, but if more of a country spends its resources on investment goods, then that bodes well for future economic growth. Okay, so long-run economic growth and the LRAS, how is that going to be reflected on that? So let's say that the growth in potential output over time can be shown as a rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So this is going to be really simple. You're just going to put here the aggregate price level. And you here have on the bottom x-axis y or equals the real GDP, our GDP. And remember, the LRAS represents the long-run aggregate supply curve. And let's say this was the year 1908. Well, over time, the LRAS has shifted to LRAS2. And let's say this was 1958. And then it's shifted to where it is in 2008. Maybe I won't put as much of a shift here because it indicates that the period of time between 1908 and 1958 perhaps was a time of more growth, relatively speaking, than 1958 than in 2008. So this would be LRAS3. So this is, it really is this rising productivity, by whatever means. That's what grows the economy, and not what we've talked about, shifting the aggregate demand. This was all that stuff. In the long run, it really doesn't matter. So in the short run, you can try to boost aggregate demand as much as you want. In the short run, it might work, but if you use monetary policy, you throw money in there. But in the end, the money is neutral. The only way to actually improve an economy is to invest in human capital, technology, physical capital, factors of production. So short run to the long run. So we're going to combine this together and see how this looks like on a aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph here. So let's take a look here at the following. So let's say the initial equilibrium is E1. So again, the short run to the long run, Y1 is going to be greater than the potential output. So eventually, low unemployment will cause nominal wages to rise, and that leads to a leftward shift of the SRAS curve. So the new equilibrium is at E2 here. So let's have the labeling squared away. This is going to be the aggregate price level. And here is going to be on the bottom our GDP, which equals to Y. And you're going to have the aggregate demand right here. Aggregate demand. And you're going to have the aggregate supply, or the short run aggregate supply, SRAS. And here, let's label this as Y1 because that is the current output. And then this is PL1, which is the current price level, because in the short run is the intersection of SRAS and AD1 is the current price level and the current output here. Now, if Y1 is greater than the potential output, okay, if Y1 is greater than the potential output, then this is going to be to the right. Y1 is going to be to the right of YP. So what you would have is you would have the LRAS right here. So this would be the LRAS. Okay, the LRAS, and this would be YP, Y potential. So what happens? Eventually, low unemployment, because the economy is basically heating up. It's heated up. It's greater than its potential output. It will cause nominal wages to rise. So if wages rise, we know that that's one of the reasons that would shift the SRAS back to the left here. So the SRAS shifts to the left here. Now keep in mind, Keynesian economics would be let's shift the aggregate demand back to the left here. But if the market were left to correct itself in the long run, then the SRAS would shift back to the left because nominal wages would rise. And you would get back to this higher price level with higher wages. So that's basically what's going on. In a good economy, then workers have a little bit more of a leverage, so wages would naturally rise and the SRAS would shift to the left and you would go back to equilibrium. Now, short run to long run. Let's look at the opposite scenario here. Short run to the long run, where Y1 is less than YP. So let's say the initial equilibrium is E1. So let's draw it as I'm going over so that you see what's actually going on. So let's label E1 here. So let's say this is the aggregate demand, AD1, and you have the SRAS. And let's label this as E1. And remember, E1 is actually just Y1, the current output, and PL1 now. Maybe it's probably better to have labeled it first here, but let's put aggregate price level. And here is Y. It's equals to our GDP, real GDP. And so eventually, high unemployment, well, if Y1 is less than YP, then this is going to be to the left of YP. So let's draw a straight vertical line to the right of Y1, and this is LRAS. Okay, so eventually, high unemployment will cause nominal wages to fall. So people are without jobs, so they're going to accept lower wages, and so therefore, lower wages means that employers are going to like this. It leads to this rightward shift of the SRAS curve. So the new equilibrium is at E2. So SRAS with lower wages, lower nominal wages, shifts back to where YP is. So this is YP, potential output here. And that's where E2 is. And the price level goes down. So if nothing happens, if the government doesn't mess with the aggregate demand, then in the long run, then the SRAS will shift to the right, as shown right here, because nominal wages will decrease. So let's take a look at example number 1 here. So long-run economic growth depends almost entirely on which of the following. So technological change, you know what, I'm not gonna, it sounds like a possible answer, seems like a weak answer, so I'm gonna put a dot right here. Probably not, but who knows. Rising productivity. Productivity leads to long-run economic growth. This looks like the correct answer here. So I'm gonna put a check mark here. Increased labor force participation. Does that help? Yes, it does, but again, probably not the best answer. Rising real GDP per capita. You know what? Again, this sounds like a possible answer here, but you know what? This is what happens as a result of economic growth, but that's not the cause. Again, real GDP per capita is more of an indicator that economic growth has taken place rather than the cause of. And again, population growth, it helps, but again, kind of a weak answer. So again, you have kind of 4 answers, or if you kind of rationalize it, maybe it might be correct. But again, rising productivity, that's really what drives economic growth. So these 4 answers are incorrect. Let's cross them out and circle the correct answer. Rising productivity is what leads to long-run economic growth. Okay, example number 2. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. Show what happens to a production possibilities graph with cars and computers when there's an increased productivity with a country's labor force. So, the labor force, for some reason or another, they're able to produce at a higher rate than before. So let's take a look at this cars and computers. Again, any 2 items in the economy. Again, you're going to have this production possibilities frontier that is increasing opportunity costs. And what happens? If there's increased productivity with a labor force, then, let's say points A and B are points of efficiency. So A, B would be points of efficiency. And just for good measure, points of inefficiency would be point C. So anywhere underneath the production possibilities frontier would be underutilization or points of inefficiency. Okay, and again, if there's increased productivity in the labor force, then what happens is that there is an increase in the production possibilities frontier. And let's put new points here. Let's put points D and point E. So points D and E would represent new points of efficiency. With economic growth, points D and E are now possible. So these are new points of efficiency. And just for the heck of it, let's create an F here. So F is, these are impossible points. Because by definition, these are points of efficiency. So F is impossible unless there's trade. Unless there is specialization in trade, which there is in an economy. We are able to consume more and more because countries specialize and trade. Okay, let's go ahead and go to example number 3 here. in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, supply model, long-run economic growth is shown by which of the following here? Is there a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve, a rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve, a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve, or leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve? Okay, so if you're not paying attention, they all kind of mesh together, sounds exactly the same. But keep in mind, long-run economic growth has nothing to do with aggregate demand. So let's cross out anything that has to do with aggregate demand here. So aggregate demand curve. Another aggregate demand curve here. Okay, so now we're left with, okay, is it long run or short run? Well, okay, economic growth, long run, has to do with the long run, not the short run. So rightward shift, that just means lower wages. Leftward shift just means higher wages. So this answer is quite the sensible answer here. There's going to be a rightward shift of the long run aggregate supply curve. So that's a pretty simple understanding of what economic growth is, a rightward shift of the LRAS curve. Okay, example number 4. Let's go over this here, the final example. Which of the following is listed among the key sources of growth in potential output? So what's going to really help an economy out in the long run? So let's see if any of these examples resonate. Expansionary fiscal policy. Again, is that going to help out the long run economy? And answer to that is no. It's not gonna really change an economy for the better in the long run. Again, it's more of a short-term solution here. Expansionary monetary policy. Again, you're just adding the money supply or contracting it. You're not actually increasing the economic well-being in the long run here. A rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Again, this has to do more with the reduction of wages, nominal wages. Investment in human capital, or all of the above. Well, we know all of the above has to be incorrect because we've proven A, B, and C are actually incorrect. So investment in human capital is absolutely what's going to increase long-run economic growth. Okay, so again, you can look at all these things here, but if you want to look at the true measure of economic growth, it really has to do with the long run rather than the short run. Thank you for watching educator.com.